All right. Hey, what's up? What's up? How you doing today? Man, I am excited. I have an hour for or less just to hang out and to, maybe get into a look on JavaScript, maybe not, maybe catch up from where I was yesterday. And maybe that's what we can do. And I figured I might just come in, and we can talk for a little while and we can just get this party started. All right, man. So yeah, I came online and I found this thing called JS bin, and this is so cool because I can now um I can create like JavaScript online. I don't have to launch VS Code or whatever. uh, Console. uh So run. Oh, I have to ask it to run. Okay, so it's not automatic. I have to actually ask it to run. Oh yeah, so I just tested. I've defined this variable one. Call variable is a number called one, and I've called it here one. And that's actually a little bit of fun because now I can assume that I know you know, some of this, some of this, some of this, some of this, some of this. Yeah, let's just find out where we stopped yesterday in our video yesterday. I know our internet's a little bit slow. So, by the way, how did I find out? I found this video on YouTube. So, YouTube is a very cool resource to learn programming and whatever. And I find myself watching a lot of videos and stuff. And so I don't want to just be watching videos and doing nothing. I want to participate actually. Maybe I could instead, because I have slow internet, I could actually just participate by doing this. You know what I can do is I can remove this as a window and then take this as another window and then have it stay side to side. And then now what I can do is I can listen to what he does and just follow along, right? Uh so let's I hope it will play. We're going to do whatever he does and we're just going to follow along to this guy Tolu. All right, let's go.
Is to write two backslashes, then write your comment. So
All
I'm
right,
gonna leave a comment with these two backslashes, and just write our coding challenge for today.
all
And
right.
that challenge is to write a JavaScript function that accepts a string as a parameter and returns the number of vowels in that string. All right, so this comment is getting too long, so I'm just gonna create a second comment below it
Mm-hmm.
so that we can easily see the whole thing. All right. All right, awesome. You just wrote your first JavaScript comment. So now you might be wondering, what is a JavaScript function? What is a string, a parameter, return, whatever? Don't worry, we are going to touch on each part of that coding challenge, and I'm going to show you how to actually write all of those different things.
Yeah, all
But
right.
the first thing I'm going to talk to you about are strings. What is a JavaScript string? A string in JavaScript is a series of characters wrapped in quotation marks. So simply put, quotation marks, this is a string. This is a series of characters wrapped in quotation marks. You can do double quotes, single quotes, it doesn't matter. A string is just a series of characters wrapped in quotation marks. All right. Now that we know what a string is, let's talk about variables. A variable is a way to store information or data so that you can reference it later using that variable. So we can store our string in a variable and then use that variable to reference our string later on. The way that you define a variable in JavaScript is to type var, this var keyword, and then write the name of your variable. So let's call our variable my string. Ooh, my string, and we will set it equal to this is a string. Let me delete this one up here.
Mm-hmm.
And you always end JavaScript statements with a semicolon.
Right.
So we have now defined a variable that's called my string, and the value of this variable is equal to this is a string. Okay. Now, something that you may have noticed is how my variable
Mm.
is written with two words. So I have my and string, and the first letter of string is capitalized. So this syntax or this way or style of writing code when it comes to naming variables is called camel case.
Camel
Kind of like
case.
a camel has humps.
Mm-hmm.
Our variable name has humps. So anytime that you are defining a variable or a function name, which we'll get to later, with two or more words, you have to use the camel case syntax in JavaScript.
All right.
Now that we know what a string is, let's talk about the console, which is what we have open here. So
Mm-hmm.
this console is a place that we can log information to see what is happening inside of our JavaScript code.
Mm-hmm.
So we can use the console to actually log our string to see what information our string holds.
Yeah.
And the way that you log information to the console is by just typing console.log parentheses, and then inside of those parentheses, you put the information or object that you want to print or log to the console. So let's see what the value of our variable is. So inside of those parentheses, we will put my string, and then just come up here and press run, and boom, you see that now returns this is a string, right? Which is now telling you that this variable, the value that this variable is storing, is equal to what we set it to up here.
Yep.
So we can pretty much log anything to the console. We don't always have to log a variable. If we want, we can actually log a string directly in our console.log statement.
Mm-hmm.
So I can do something like this: console.log parentheses and quotations. I cannot spell today. Hello world. Then you come up here and click clear, then run, and boom. So we are printing our variable up here, and right underneath it, we are printing hello world. We are printing an actual string versus up here, we are
Mm-hmm.
printing our variable that references a string. Now that we know what strings are, we know what variables are, and we've touched on the console, the next thing to
Mm-hmm.
talk about is functions. What is a JavaScript function?
Mm-hmm.
So a function is just simply a block of code that performs a certain task. So let's say that we want to define a function that console logs hello world every time that we run it, right? The way that you define functions in JavaScript is to write the function keyword and then the name of the function, sort of like how we did with variables, print hello world, parentheses, then you put the curly braces, and inside of the curly braces, this is where that block of code that you want your function to run each and every time will be. So let's say that we just want our function to print hello world to the console. We
Mm-hmm.
just use our console.log parentheses hello world, and let's delete everything here. The way that you call your function is just typing the name of that function as you have it defined, and then click and run. So if you come up here and you click run, we'll now see that every time that we call print hello world, this code console logs hello world to the console. So
Mm-hmm.
again, if we write this twice or three times, right? If you click clear, every time that this code runs, we should expect to see console log three times. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
So that is a JavaScript function. A function is just simply a block of code that performs a certain task. Instead of saying hello world, what if I want to be able to pass different values each and every time and still have our function work the same way by
Mm-hmm.
logging that information to the console? So that's where parameters come in. A parameter is a named variable or a variable that we define when we're defining our function.
Mm-hmm.
And we can now use that variable or parameter inside of the code block of our function. If we want to change our function
What does
to make
that?
sure that we console log whatever is passed into it each and every time, what
Let's.
do the code that information passed this code runs, we should expect to see console log 3 times. You see that? So that is a JavaScript function. A function is just simply a block of code that performs a certain task. Instead of saying hello world, what if I want to be able to pass different values each and every time and still have our function work the same way by logging that information to the console? So that's where parameters come in. A parameter is a named variable or a variable that we define when we're defining our function. And we can now use that variable we come in. A parameter is a named variable or a variable that we define when we're defining our function. And we can now use that variable or parameter inside of the code block function if it performs a certain task. Instead of saying hello world, what if I want to be able to pass different values each and every time and still have our function work the same way by logging that information to the console? So that's where parameters come in. A parameter is a named variable or a variable that we define when we're defining our function. And we can now use that variable or parameter inside of the code block of our function. If we want to change our function to make sure that we console log whatever is passed into it each and every time, what we would do is here in our definition, we would actually set a variable string passed in. So this variable can now be used inside of our function to reference whatever is entered into these parentheses whenever our function is called. So we can now take this variable and replace the text in our console.log with this variable, right? So now anytime that we call print hello world, we have to pass something into it. So this is a new string. So click clear, then run, and you see this string that we pass into our function is being saved into this parameter or named variable, and that variable is now being console logged out. So anything that we pass in will be saved into this variable for our function to use. All right, so that is a parameter. A parameter is just a way for your function to take in information from the outside, save it into that named variable, and reference that variable inside of your function. Now that we know about functions, the console, strings, and variables, the next thing that we're going to talk about are arrays. So you know how we define a variable called myString? This variable is only storing one thing, right? It's only storing our string. This is a string. But what if we wanted to define a variable that stores multiple strings or multiple items at the same time? That's where arrays come in. So with an array, you can store multiple items at a time and then save that array into a variable so that your variable is now holding multiple pieces of information in one object, right? So the way that you define an array is by using the brackets, then putting whatever information comma separated inside of that array. Just to help make that clear, you define an array by putting brackets. And let's say that we want our array to be a string of cars, right? So I'm going to put Honda, Ford, Lexus, right? So this is an array of strings. This array contains multiple strings inside of it versus just one, like our variable up here. So so the thing is, we can now store this array inside of a variable so that we can reference it later. So I can come here and define a variable and we can call it array of cars equal, right? So we have now defined a variable called array of cars, and we are setting the value of this variable equal to our array that has strings of car names in it. So that is an array. An array is an object that can contain one or more items at a time. Now, something very interesting about arrays is that arrays are zero index, meaning that the first item inside of this array is not at position 1. Zero index means the first position actually starts at position 0. So this first item is at position 0. The second one is at position 1. The third one is at position, see, I got lost with that, position 2. So arrays are zero index, meaning that you start counting the position of each item in the array, not at 1, but at 0. So this is 0, 1, 2. Now, that is important when it comes to grabbing the values inside of an array. So, but before that, let's console log our array. Console.log array of cars. And let's delete, actually, let's turn this into a comment so that it doesn't run. Just to, again, show you how comments work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now, if we come up here and we click clear, we should see our array console log. So you see how down here we are defining our variable that is storing an array, and we are now console logging our array to the console.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to arrays being zero indexed, that is very important when it comes to grabbing the information out of an array.
Yeah.
So let's say that I want to grab the first item inside of this array, right? This string of Honda.
Mm-hmm.
How would I do that? And remember, I said arrays are zero index. So the way that you can grab the values inside of an array using their index is by simply going to the array or whatever variable is referencing that array and putting brackets, then putting the index of the item that you want to grab. So I want to grab the first item inside of my array. So that means the index is 0.
Mm-hmm.
So I put 0 and I console log that. I should expect to see Honda in my console. So I come up here, I click clear just now, and when you hit run, boom, you see Honda, right? So if I change this value, I change it to 1, and I click clear,
Mm-hmm.
I should see Ford, right? So
Yep.
again, if I change this to 3, what do you expect to see if we change this to 3, right? Because remember, we only have 3 items in here, and you start counting at 0. So this is 0, 1, 2. We don't have a position 3.
Yep.
So let's hit run and let's see what that does.
Mm-hmm.
Undefined. That means nothing exists in that position.
Yeah.
All right. But we'll touch on that a bit much later. All right. So we have now learned about JavaScript strings, functions, variables, arrays.
Mm-hmm.
So a cool trick is that you can actually turn a string into an array of words. So we can take our string up here. You see how it says this is a string? We can actually split this up into an array of each individual word in this string, right? But let me show you how to search for that. So if you just open up a second tab and type JavaScript, turn string into array. And we'll see W3 Schools is actually a very good resource to learn different methods. This is called a method. They are basically functions that were already written and defined in the JavaScript language. So if we click this, we see that JavaScript has a method called split, right? So you see how up here they are defining a variable called str. I'm guessing it stands for string. And they're setting it equal to how are you doing today? And they're calling str.split. I'm just going to copy this code, exit out of here, and go back to our JS bin. And I'm going to enter this code here. But first, let me turn this into a comment so it doesn't run, right? And we are going to console.log this variable res. So res is storing the result, right? The result of calling .split on this variable. So if I come up here and click clear and I run, you see how calling .split on this string turned it into an array of each individual word in that string. So we can turn a string into an array of each individual word by simply calling .split on it and passing in quotations with the space between it. All right. And that's important because if we go back to our documentation here for the .split method, you see here it says, if an empty string is used as the separator, the string is split between each character. So basically, we can print or split a string into each individual letter by calling .split and passing an empty quotation mark or as our separator. So if we come here and we just delete this space here, and let's just come up here and click run, as you can see, it now splits this string by each individual character. If we don't put anything, what do you think it's going to do? Click clear, run, doesn't do anything because it doesn't know how you want to split the string. So again, just make sure that you come back and kind of read up on this definition here of how to use the split method on a string. Anytime that you are using .split, you have to tell the split method how you want it to split, right? So here by passing in by passing in quotation marks with a space between it, you are telling the .split method to split this variable here anywhere that it sees a space, right? Does that now make sense? Like anywhere it sees a space to split that word. So let's say that our string said, let's say that I put a space between H, O, and W, right? And I come back here and I put quotation marks and I click run. It's going to actually do that. I think it'll make more sense if I do this. Let's say, hi TJ, comma, How are you doing today? And what if I want to split my string everywhere that there's a comma? So there is only a comma in one place after TJ. So if I put split and I put comma between these quotation marks, what do you think is going to happen? Right? Like, how many items do you think is going to be inside of our array? It should just be 2, right? So if I come up here and I click clear and I hit run, you see, hi TJ, and how are you doing today? So basically, this anytime that you use the dot split method, you have to tell it how you want it to split the string, right? So I am telling it to split the string everywhere it sees a comma right here. If I remove this comma and I just put the empty space, I'm telling it to split the string every time that you see a space, right? So if I click run, you see, and now I blah, blah, blah. So just to kind of go back to the one that'll be most relevant for us, right? If we wanted to split it everywhere that it doesn't see a space, right? It's just an empty string. Let me click clear. We just have to pass in split and pass in an empty string without any spaces between it. We click run and it'll split our string and turn it into an array of each individual letter. All right, so now that we know how the dot split method works, make sure that you actually come back here to W3 Schools and that you finish reading this documentation to get a really good understanding of how this method works, okay? So now that we know dot split, we know about arrays and etc., let's actually clear up our code here and let's go back to our example of doing console log and printing our array of cars here. Oops, this is still getting undefined. Let me just put index of 0. Click clear and run. And actually, let me just log our whole array, right? So now the last thing that we have to talk about in JavaScript before we start to piece together the steps that we'll use to solve our problem are loops, right? Like, how do we loop through an array? So let's say that I wanted to write code that console logged out each item of an array, right? Like item 1, item 2, etc., etc. How would we do that? So in JavaScript, you would do that by using a loop. So let's just open up a new tab and go to, and remember, we type our keyword, we want to, JavaScript, we want to loop through an array. So we type that, and let's go back to W3 Schools. And this will now tell us about the JavaScript for loop. So this is one of the most common ways of looping through an object or looping through our array. So a JavaScript for loop has 3 statements that it uses to basically figure out how to process and execute the loop, right? So here you see that we have one statement, right? I equals 0. And then we have another statement, I is less than cars.length. And cars, as you can probably guess by the way that they're calling cars with the index, you can probably guess that cars is a variable that's equal to an array of cars, like strings, just the same way that we define our array of cars. So, and then the third statement here is I++, right? And I++ is just a shorthand of adding 1 to the variable I. So if we come down here, we can read a bit more about that. So as you can see, the for loop has the following syntax: statement 1, semicolon, 2, semicolon, statement 3, and then the code that you want your loop to execute each and every time goes between the curly braces. So this is how we would write a for loop. And coming down here again, this is another example for us, right? So the first statement, they are setting a variable before the loop starts, right? Var I equals 0. That's what they are doing right here. And then statement 2 is the condition, right? Statement 2 is the condition for executing the code block. So statement 2 defines the condition for the loop to run, right? So for our loop to run here, you see how they're doing I less than 5? They're saying I must be less than 5 for this loop to execute. And then statement 3 increases a value. The way they put I++, so each time the code block in the loop is being executed, I++ will run. So every time that our loop executes, it calls this code here I++. And I++ is just a way of adding 1 to I. I'll show you more about that a bit later. All right. So basically, when you are writing a JavaScript for loop, the first thing that you do is set your counter variable, right? This is what you are using to track whether your loop should execute or not. And they are using a variable called I, and they're setting it equal to 0, which makes sense because, if you are looping through an array, remember the first item in an array is at position 0, right? And then they're saying that anytime I is less than 5, that is the condition when this loop can execute. So every time that this loop executes the code block here, each and every time it adds 1 to I, right? So remember, the first time the loop is going to execute, right, I is equal to 0, right? So is I less than 5? It is. So this code will execute. And then we add 1 to I by doing I++. So I is not equal to 1. Is I less than 5? It is.
Mm.
So this code will execute again, right? So let's say that we get all the way to where I is equal to 6, right? Is I less than 5? No, it's not. So this code is not going to execute. That's it. The
Mm.
loop is done. Right, so let's use that example inside of our code, actually, just to kind of make it a bit easier to understand. So let's say that we want to define a loop that, actually, let's just define a simple for loop. So we'll do for parentheses var I, or let me just make it a bit more clear. Let's name our counter, right? So var counter equals 0 semicolon. So anytime that our counter is less than 5, right, we want to execute code. And then after that, you see how they were doing I plus plus? We can do I plus plus, but I plus plus, remember I told you it's shorthand. So it's shorthand for just saying counter equals counter plus 1, right? So this is saying that take the current value of counter, when it first starts at 0, add 1 to it, and then reset the variable counter to be equal to the result of running this, all right?
Mm.
So that's essentially what counter plus plus is doing, or I plus plus. It's just taking that variable and adding 1 to it, and then resetting that variable to be equal to the result of that. So when we now have our for loop, we now have to put our curly braces, which is where we will put the code that we want to execute. So let's say that we want to console log our counter every time, right? So we can just do console.log counter, just to show you how the for loop works here. Let's comment out the console log of the array of cards. So come here, we'll click clear, click run, and you see how, remember, the very first time that our loop runs, counter is equal to 0, right? So is counter less than 5? Yes, it is. So our for loop executes the code block. And right now, the code block, all it's doing is console.log whatever counter is. And remember, the first time the code runs, counter is 0. So that's why the first thing you see is 0. And remember, after every execution of the code block, we then run this third statement, right? So we take counter. So counter is currently 0, and we add 1 to it. So we now update. We now set counter to be equal to 1. And then our code comes back to this second statement, and it says, is counter less than 5? Well, is 1 less than 5? It is. So it executes this code block again, which it printed out 1. And then it went back to this third statement, and it took counter, it added 1 to it. So 1 plus 1 is 2. And it set counter to be equal to the new value, which is 2. So is 2 less than 5? Did it? So it just, our for loop just keeps going through this over and over again until it gets to a position, right? So let's say we get to 4, right?
Hold
So
up.
4 is,
Hold up. Why did I not get that? I thought I got that. For, he defined var, counter is first is 0, but counter is less than 5. Then counter is counter plus 1. Console.log counter. What did I miss? Maybe that's what I missed. Syntax error. Yeah. Counter is equals to 0. Then counter is less than 5. Then counter. What? Yes. That's how you know you don't remember a concept for loop. So var counter is equals to 0. Close that one. A counter is less than 5. Close that one. Counter equals counter plus 1. open curly brace, console.log counter. Ah, man.
Execute again, right? So let's say that we get all the way to where I is equal to 6, right? Is I less than 5? No, it's not. So this code is not going to execute. That's it. The loop is done. Right, so let's use that example inside of our code, actually, just to kind of make it a bit easier to understand. So let's say that we want to define a loop that, actually, let's just define a simple for loop. So we'll do for, parentheses, var I, or let me just make it a bit more clear. Let's name our counter, right? So var counter equals 0, semicolon. So anytime that our counter is less than 5, right, we want to execute code. And then after that, you see how they were doing I++? We can do I++, but I++, remember I told you it's shorthand. So it's shorthand for just saying counter equals counter plus 1, right? So this is saying that take the current value of counter, when it first starts at 0, add 1 to it, and then reset the variable counter to be equal to the result of running this, all right? So that's essentially what counter plus plus is doing, or I plus plus. It's just taking that variable and adding 1 to it, and then resetting that variable to be equal to the result of that. So when we now have our for loop, we now have to put our curly braces, which is where we will put the code that we want to execute. So let's say that we want to console log our counter every time, right? So we can just do console.log counter, just to show you how the for loop works here. Let's comment out the console log of the array of cards. So come here, we'll click clear, click run, and you see how, remember, the very first time that our loop runs, counter is equal to 0, right? So is counter less than 5? Yes, it is. So our for loop executes the code block. And right now, the code block, all it's doing is console.log whatever counter is. And remember, the first time the code runs, counter is 0. So that's why the first thing you see is 0. And remember, after every execution of the code block, we then run this third statement, right? So we take counter, so counter is currently 0, and we add 1 to it. So we now update, we now set counter to be equal to 1. And then our code comes back to this second statement, and it says, is counter less than 5? Well, is 1 less than 5? It is. So it executes this code block again, which it printed out 1. And then it went back to this third statement, and it took counter, it added 1 to it. So 1 plus 1 is 2. And it set counter to be equal to the new value, which is 2. So is 2 less than 5? So it just, our for loop just keeps going through this over and over again until it gets to a position, right? So let's say we get to 4, right? So 4 is less than 5. So 4 is less than 5, so our for loop executes and console logs out 4, right? Then we come back up here, right? So if counter is currently 4, then we add 1 to it. That means counter is now equal to 5. Is 5 less than 5? No. So our code doesn't execute, which is why which is why the console log only goes up to 4, right? So now remember, this is very interesting, or this is very useful, because counter stores a number value, and we can use this number value to reference our array to access those values, right? Because remember, we have our array of cars here, and Honda is at index 0, right? So let's say that I put array of cars, and I want to access the index, right? So remember, instead of doing 0, I can just now put counter, and counter would just keep looping through and updating that number for me automatically. So if I click clear, and I click run, completely spelled that wrong. This is why you don't code live a lot of times, and I could edit that out, but you guys should be able to kind of see all of these different errors, and we can read that, right? So it's saying reference error. Counter is not defined, and as you can see, it's looking for something called COOUNTR, right? So that means when I came here, I actually spelled counter wrong. So misspellings are going to be the cause for a lot of errors, or maybe not a lot, but when you are coding as a software engineer, you are definitely going to run into a few issues or errors that come about just because you spell something wrong. Okay, so this is actually a very common error until you learn how to spell a lot better than me. So if I delete this and just spell counter correctly, press clear, then press run, you see that, right? Like it is actually looping through each item in my array. Remember, the array only has 3 items in it, right? And the first item is 0, 1, 2, right? So basically everything after that is actually not inside of our array. And we can see what the what the counter for that is. So if we just put console.log, let's log our counter right before we log the index of the array. So we click clear, we'll now see, okay, whenever our counter is 0 and we're grabbing an array of cars at 0, we're getting Honda. You know, when it's 1, right, because Ford is at position 1 in our array, we get Ford. When it's 2, it's Lexus. When it's 3, we don't have anything in position 3. When it's 4, we have nothing, right? So how can we get our for loop to only execute based on how long our array is? So you see how up here we just put a random number, I just put 5. We can actually use the length of our array, right? So if we do console.log and I did length, if I did console.log array of cars dot length. So dot length is a method that you can call on an array. And dot length tells you how long or how many items are in that array. So we should expect it to return 3, right? So if I come up here and I click clear and I press run, you see how it puts 3 up here? Here, just to make that clear, let me turn these into comments. Let's turn the code in our for loop into comments. And then clear, then press run. We see 3. We have 3 items inside of our array. So we cannot use the length of our array because our array is what we are console logging out. We can use the length of our array in this condition to check if the counter is less than the number of items in our array. Execute. So we can just take this array of cars dot length. So this is now saying if counter is less than the length of our array of cars, right? So right now the array of cars has 3 items in it. So this is like saying if the counter is less than 3, execute. And this is important because remember, we are starting our counter at 0. So that means that 2, like when the counter gets to 2, 2 is still less than 3. So it's gonna be able to loop through each and every item inside of our array. So let me just demonstrate that by uncommenting this code. And let's comment this console log of the length here. So click clear, then hit run. You see, when counter is 0, it prints out Honda. When it's 1, Ford. When it's 2, Lexus. So this is now how you can use a for loop to loop through each and every item inside of your array. So again, make sure that you come back to this documentation and you read through all of the different examples, just to really make sure that you understand how this for loop is working.
Okay.
All right, so we have learned a lot today. We learned about what a string is, a parameter, functions, arrays. We just learned the dot length method. We learned how to use split. I don't want to overwhelm you, but hopefully you can kind of see where all of this is going, right? Because these are little bits and pieces of information that we're going to use to actually start writing the code for our solution, right? So based on everything that we just learned, let's actually start to write the steps that we'll use to solve our coding challenge. So let's just come up here and delete all of this. And I'm going to now show you how to write a multi-line comment in JavaScript, right? So the first type of comment that I showed you earlier was how to write single-line comments. So to write a single-line comment, remember, you just put the 2 backslashes, then you write your comment, blah, blah, blah. But if you want to write a multi-line comment and not have to put these backslashes for each line, all you have to do is put 1 backslash, the asterisk, then put the asterisk, then a backslash to close it. So now everything here is a comment, and I can keep writing. These are all comments. Okay, so now I can basically just write all my comments inside of these 2 things. So this is specifying the beginning of our comments, and this at the bottom, this is specifying the end of our comments. All right, so if I come up here and I click clear, none of this is going to show up anywhere. All right, until I'm actually clicking clear. So now that we know some basic JavaScript, let's start talking through the different steps that we would take to solve our coding challenge. So our challenge is to write a JavaScript function that accepts a string as a parameter and returns the number of vowels in that string. right? So step one, right? Step one that we would take is to just write a or define a JavaScript function that accepts a string as a parameter. And that's step one. We just define the shell of our function without any code or logic yet. Right? Now, step two, right? So we're trying to accept a string as a parameter and count and return the number of vowels in that string. So one thing that we know is that we have to analyze each and every letter in whatever string is being passed in so that we can compare and see, okay, is this letter a vowel or not? So we learn how to do that by using the dot split method to split a string into an array of each individual letters. So we can actually make that our step two. So step two would be to split the string passed in and turn it into turn, I cannot spell today, guys. Turn it into an array of each individual letter and store it in a variable. And let me just put this on a new line so it doesn't start getting too long. All right. So far we have two steps, right? We have defined a function that takes in a string as a parameter. And we also have step two where we are splitting that string and we're turning it into an array of each individual letter. Perfect. So now remember, we are trying to count how many vowels are in that string, but how will our function keep count? So maybe step three will be to define a variable that we can use to keep the current count. And we can just set the initial variable value to be 0, right? So step three, define a variable called count, I guess, and set the default or set the initial value to be equal to 0. All right. So now that we have a variable called count and we're setting the initial value to be equal to 0, we actually have to start doing what? Looping through our array of letters before we can start to check if each letter is a vowel or not. But actually, how will our function know what a vowel is? We need to tell it that, right? So let's just do step 4, define a variable that defines what a vowel is. Store it in an array. We can just create an array of vowels. And that's pretty straightforward now, right? So that's just brackets and we have a string A, I, E, O, U. All right, so now we have 4 steps. So now that we basically have everything that we need to start to kind of analyze our letters, the thing left to do is to start looping through each letter in our array of letters, right? So step 5 will be to start looping through our array of letters. All right. So when we are looping through each letter in our array of letters, what do we want to do with each letter, right? We want to see, is this letter a vowel or not, right? So basically, step 6, check if the current letter in our loop is a vowel. That's step 6. And if it is a vowel, what do we want to do? We want to increase our count by 1, right? So basically, as soon as we find a vowel, okay, this is a vowel, we want to take our count and add 1 to it. So we go from count being equal to 0 to being equal to 1. And then when we find another vowel, we add 1 to that. So count is now 2. And we just keep going and going and going until we finish looping through each letter in our array, right? So step 7, increase the count variable by 1 for every letter that's a vowel. All right. Now, after our loop is done running, what do we want our function to return again? We want our function to return the number of vowels in that string. So we basically just wanted to return the variable count, right? So step 8, return the count of vowels. All right, I think that's it, right? So our coding challenge here today was to write a JavaScript function that accepts a string as a parameter and returns the number of vowels in that string. So step one, we're defining a JavaScript function that accepts a string as a parameter. And step two, we are now splitting the string that's passed in. We're turning it into an array of each individual letter and storing that into a variable. So we can actually just call that variable array of letters. And then step three, we're defining a variable called count. And I think we can do better. We can call that variable number of vowels, right? So always try to be super descriptive with what you name your variables and your functions to make your code readable, right? Meaning that if a different engineer comes and looks at the code that you write, they can follow along with the naming of your variables and your functions to kind of just really understand what's going on, right? So like me right now, if I see a variable that's called number of vowels, I'm going to expect that this variable stores a number, and this number is the number of vowels from somewhere, right? And then step four, we're defining a variable that defines what a vowel is, right? So for us to write a function that counts how many vowels are in a string, our function needs to know what a vowel is, simply put. And we do that by defining a variable that stores an array of vowels, and we can now use that array later on. And after we have that, step five, we actually start looping through our array of letters, right? And every time that we loop through each letter, so we check if the current letter in our loop is a vowel. And then on step seven, if that letter is a vowel, we add one to our count, right? We increase the count variable by one for every letter that's a vowel. And then in step eight, right, whenever our loop is done running, we want our function to return the count of vowels. That's it. That is how we are going to solve our coding challenge. And I always implore beginners to write out steps to solving the problem before you start writing code. Because if you get lost searching for solutions and etc., you can always come back to these steps and really kind of help you remember what you're trying to accomplish. Okay, so this is it for today. This is just part one of this video. In the next video, we will actually start writing the code for each and every one of these steps. And based on everything that you guys learned today, you can actually start to try writing the solution to this code on your own. And I'll see you pretty soon for part two. So stay tuned.
So does he have part two? Could we do part two? Let's go back to his channel and look for part two, or come back and solve this.
Hello everyone, my name is T.
He actually never did a part two. Can we try and solve it now on our own? So define a JavaScript function that accepts a string as a parameter. Alright, that accepts a string as a parameter. Right, so then step two, split the string passed in and turn it into an array of each individual letter and store it in a variable. Call the variable number of vowels. Split the string passed in and turn it into an array. Right. Okay, let's do this.